Hi everybody, welcome back to my art channel, and today I'm going to show you how to paint this yellow and orange tulip using acrylic paints. Yep, you heard me correctly, acrylic paints. So I'll quickly show you how I got set up for acrylic paint. So I've got my palette there, little ceramic palette, I've got my tubes of acrylic. I drew out the tulip using watercolor pencils on a box canvas, a bit different to usual. Then I got my iPad set up there with my reference photo. I got the paints right next to me to hand in case I need any other shades or colors. And I got some water, I got some towel, and I got my brush. Now I've only got this small set of 12 milliliter tubes of acrylic, so I just pop out some small amounts on my palette to start with. And you can see me begin to start painting on one of the smallest parts of the flower. I'm doing the flower first, which might seem a bit unusual, might want to do the background first, but I want to do the flower because I really want to get into all these yellows and oranges. So I haven't used acrylic paint in over 20 years. Not kidding. So this was a real sort of jump for me, a bit of a outside my comfort zone kind of opportunity to relearn how to use acrylics. And the first thing that I noticed popping them on with this brush is how buttery the consistency with these acrylics was. Really thick. It's got texture, unlike what I'm used to using, say for instance when I'm using watercolors. So the texture hit me straight away, but it was actually kind of good. And you can see me putting on the paints here and mixing them and blending them together with a flat brush, one that I possibly wouldn't normally use when I'm doing watercolors. And it's just a synthetic, cheap, flat brush with quite a bit of spring to it. So you can see me doing quite a lot of blending of the colors on the canvas itself, and I'm not sure if this is acrylic practice, and there might be people watching this going, what are you doing? You know, if you're a sort of expert with acrylics, but this is just me kind of relearning my way after having such a long layoff with acrylics and trying to find out again what works and what doesn't, and also remembering what used to work, you know, over 20 years ago when I used to paint with them. So with that small bit out of the way, I start painting this slightly bigger petal, and I'm going in a bit closer, and so you can see me applying the yellow straight away, getting this nice buttery yellow on, adding a little bit of this color which I think is called red Milano, and just blending that in just along the edge using the flat sort of sharp edge of this brush to get a sort of delicate orange kind of color. And the main thing to sort of note here is that I haven't started using any water yet. These paints are so smooth and so buttery and flow so well that I haven't actually had to resort to using any water. And this was something that I kind of remembered from many, many years ago, that I tried to paint with acrylics, you know, hardly using any water at all. And so far, this was working absolutely fine for me. You're going to find out later in the video that that's not quite the way that I can paint with them all the time. But for now, using no water at all and just relying on the consistency of the paint was working. As long as I was nice and quick, I realized, remember, that acrylics dry quite quickly, so I was having to work nice and fast, which suits me, putting on the yellow, putting on the orange, and then adding some of these white highlights again that you can see me adding. And with this section, you can see me having to reapply the white highlights because the more I brush them, they start to blend in with the yellow underneath, which is okay, and it's nice if I'm going for that subtle kind of highlight, but I also want them to stand out. So I found I had to keep reapplying a bit of white and perhaps brush it a little less to make sure that it stayed nice and bright on the surface of this petal. So the bright yellow parts of the petal catching the light seem to be going okay. So next up I needed to start working on some of the shadow areas of this petal. So you see me put down a base coat of the yellow, then add this kind of scarlety red on top. It's got a nice reddy orange color to it. And I can use the flat sharp edge of this brush to really get some nice crisp edges, which is difficult to do with the texture of acrylic, but at the moment it's working okay. And I'm blending that red in. Then I start to add in some burgundy at the very base of this shadow and start to work that up and blend that upwards into the reddy orange color that I've got. Now I'm going to keep going upwards, but as I move upwards with the colors, I'm trying to get a bit paler and a bit lighter. So they go from dark at the bottom to light at the top. So here you'll see me add some yellow into the mix, and I sort of plop that on, and then I start blending that downwards into the red Milano, and then upwards again until I'm reaching the very top part of this kind of the shadow of this petal. Now, getting that dark shadow in there against that bright yellow was immediately giving me that really, really good contrast. So I thought I'd do the shadow bit at the bottom part of this petal as well, and thinking, right, this is starting to look okay. You know, it's got that lovely bright color that acrylics have got, and also as soon as I put in the shadows, I've got that really nice contrast. So I'm hopeful that I can make this picture look, you know, fairly 3D. So at the bottom you can see the same kind of idea. I'm putting on the red Milano, and then I will add some burgundy into the mix as well, so that I can get really, really dark shadow where the petal is curling over. And I'm just adding some yellow towards the very edge of the petal where the light obviously would be shining through it. It'd be a bit translucent and you get that warm yellow color. Now you've probably noticed that I'm using a slightly different brush to do this with. I'm using a flat-headed brush, and it's a little bit bigger than normal, but it's still shy of a 1/4 inch brush. And the reason I'm using this is a flathead brush will give me a different feel in the brush strokes. I'm using a very textural paint in acrylic, and the brush strokes are probably going to show. So instead of fighting that, trying to blend everything, you know, so that there's no brush strokes, I'm thinking, no, use a brush that will show brush strokes. So the flathead brush will allow me to do that. It's also a bigger canvas. It is 12 by 12. That's usually bigger than the size of paper that I normally use. So I've got a fair big surface to cover. So I'm thinking that a flat-headed brush and a slightly bigger brush will allow me to do that a little bit more quickly. Of course, speed being part of the essence here, because I'm using acrylic paints and they dry so quickly, I've got to be able to blend them speedily. So a big brush will help me do that. So as I move on to do the rest of the flower, I'm sort of speeding it up a little bit so you can see this get done a bit quicker. You can see my classic watercolor technique that is hard to kind of shed, in that I usually start with the very lightest color first and then do the mid-tone and then the dark tone. And this is purely because in watercolor, that's the best way to work. Otherwise you're going to find out later that, you know, you needed to make something lighter and you can't. But of course what I'm forgetting a little bit is that acrylics can be painted over. They are opaque. They are not translucent like watercolors. So I've got every ability here to slap on dark colors, and then if it looks too dark I can paint a lighter color over afterwards and it should look absolutely fine. And you can see me here putting on virtually all my colors first and then adding my white highlights last. So I guess at this point I'm employing both techniques of watercolor and some of the ones that I remember about using acrylics, all wrapped up together in this one painting. So the interior petals you can see me doing here are a lot darker, so I rely a lot more on a lot of burgundy and a lot of this kind of red Milano color with just a little bit of yellow popped in at the top and blended in to the darker colors that I've got going on underneath. I really want the interior to be colorful but also really, really dark, and that contrast will then make the outside petals, the really yellow petals, really pop and really look as though they are three-dimensional on the surface of the canvas. So you can see me just adjusting and blending and getting those colors in, and again I'm working super quick to blend them all on the canvas, and I'm not adding any water yet at all. The only water in fact is the water that's probably in the brush after perhaps I've had to wash it, because with acrylics I forgot that sometimes your brush can get clogged with a lot of color, so you need to periodically wash all of that color off, otherwise it can get really kind of sticky. As I start blending and doing the colors and shadows on this side petal, one of the aspects of a flat-headed brush that stands out to me loads is its ability to do some really crisp and clean edges. And that sort of starts me thinking, well, hang on, why am I just using this kind of brush for acrylics here? Why don't I start doing some of my watercolor paintings using a flathead brush instead of always relying on the rounds that I usually use? So watch this space, because I could well decide to do a watercolor painting using a flathead brush in future to see what kind of different shapes and marks and edges I can get. So make sure you're subscribed so you won't miss that video when I do that. So next I move on to doing the muddy background. So I'm blending a brown and a white, and for this I've changed up brushes to a slightly bigger size 8 brush, which is a synthetic acrylic brush, but it's a little bit stiffer than the one that I was using just. And here's where I forget that it's a box canvas, so I have to do the edges, what's known as a gallery wrap, all the way around. And I didn't quite forward plan enough to get my desktop easel to make this a little bit easier to actually paint and for you to watch. But here's where I encountered my first problem. I noticed that there was a sort of bit of scuffy kind of peely dryness within the brown and the white paint. So I'm like, what's going on with that? So I carry on painting just as I was earlier, and I'm filling in these edges using the brown and white combo, and then I have to do the edge of the gallery wrap here. So you can see me painting this section here, And all of a sudden, I noticed that I'm having the same problem. The more paint that I'm put on and trying to blend, I'm getting some of this paint beginning to peel off. And I hadn't encountered that problem before, but I realized after having a little bit of research that I needed some water. So I resorted to using a little water spray bottle like this and spraying the water onto my palette, onto the paints on my palette. Just a quick spray, so there's a little bit of extra water on there, which will blend with the paint and allow the acrylic to flow a little bit more easily and freely across the canvas, and also, crucially, not dry out so quickly. And as you can see here, it's going on so beautifully and easily and smoothly without any of the paints drying and peeling up the layer that was on underneath. So it was funny, I'd gotten away without having to use water at all when I was using the colors on the flower, but as soon as I started to do the colors in the background, and I think this is partly to do with using white, then I started to get them drying quicker, and they began to clog the brush more, and they began to peel much more off the canvas unless I started adding water. But apparently you have to be careful how much water you add. If you add too much, then you will kind of decay the bond between the pigment and the binder, and that can actually lead to your acrylic lifting off the paper even worse, or not even sealing properly and just kind of flaking off. So a balance has to be achieved. So with some brown left on the palette, I thought what I would do is use this to do the dark areas in the very center of this tulip, just down at the bottom. Probably going to need a second coat later, but I wanted to use up some paint instead of wasting it. So next up were the leaves, and I decided I was going to mix the green that I was going to use to do the leaves with, and for this I was going to use my sunflower yellow that I'd already used on the tulip and blend in a bit of blue to that, so that I would get a green that had hints of the yellow that was already being used in the painting, so it would hopefully unify the painting and bring the painting together a bit more, rather than just using a green straight out of the tube. So with the leaves, I was trying to do two things. Mainly with the brush strokes, I was trying to brush stroke the paint on the way that the leaves grow. So instead of using little choppy up and down brush strokes, I was trying to use slightly longer brush strokes that followed the kind of flow and the way that the leaf was actually growing. And the other thing I was trying to do was blend my colors like I had done on the flower itself, but I was finding this trickier to do. I'm obviously introducing white to get some paler shades with the leaves, and it just wasn't working, and a lot of the canvas was showing through, and I just wasn't really satisfied. And it's at this point that I realized what I was going to have to do was two coats. I was going to have to do a sort of first coat across all of the leaves, and then once that had dried, I was going to have to go back over it with a second coat to get the effect that I wanted. So in this part of the video, you can see as I just work on each of the leaves and I put down a first pass, a first coat on the leaves. So these are quite heavy with yellow and white, but I'm not trying hard to blend anything together because I know I'm now resigned to putting a second layer on top. So I can be fairly rough with the brushwork, and I'm just sort of patching in areas that I know are going to be dark and are going to be light. One of the other things was I wasn't pleased with the blue that I'd chosen to be mixed in with the yellow. It wasn't dark enough, and I couldn't get the shadows dark enough. So I resigned myself to the fact I was going to use a darker blue when I did the second layer. So I mentioned earlier the phrase gallery wrap, and this was a new one for me. Basically, if you paint on the edges of a canvas instead of framing it, that is known as a gallery wrap. And obviously you've got this thin strip to try and paint, and it can be tricky to do. So I've got to say the desktop easel really helped here. Once I was able to put the canvas onto the desktop easel, it gave me so much more stability and made the gallery wrap sides much more easy to paint. So we're using acrylic, so that means that the first layer doesn't take long to dry, and therefore you don't have to wait long to do your second layer. So here you can see me going in doing the second layer on top of the leaves, and this is where I'm trying to give them a bit more polish, a bit more depth, and to blend some of those colors a little bit more smoothly and successfully. So I'm putting the color right on top of the first coat, and this time I've decided to introduce a new blue, a slightly darker blue into the mix. So I mixed my green as usual, like I did before, but then I resorted to using, I think it's called Sapphire in the pack, but it's pretty much a kind of ultramarine type blue, and this allowed me to get much better, darker shadows within the leaves. That green, as you can see as I put it on here and I sort of smoothly try and blend those strokes in, it's a much better darker green, which is exactly what I needed for the leaves in the background if they were to have any depth. I mean, I was conscious that I really want the flower to be the main focal point, and it is through the color and the shadows, but I also wanted the leaves to have a bit of extra shadow on them so that they had depth and they did look a little bit 3D. There was a minor drawback to using this particular shade of blue, and you'll notice it across the leaves as I paint them all, and that is it changed the way that the white looked. When I was using a white to add into the greens from before and put on highlights, it still retained a kind of a bright, kind of a yellowy quality, but this blue kind of dulled the white highlights a little bit and it changed their tone. Not terribly, but noticeably different, I think, to what it had been before. But considering I wanted the flower in the center to be really bright and those bright yellows to really ping off the page, perhaps the fact that the blue affected the white highlights in this way on the leaves meant that it would keep the leaves in the background a little bit and focus more the yellow tones on the flower than perhaps on the leaves in the background, which I know kind of undoes what I was trying to do when I blended the green using the same yellow from the flower in the first place. So maybe I should have balanced those colors a little bit better on the leaves once I introduced that blue. But it's just one of those things that sometimes happens when you're painting, and at this point I was just thinking, I really want to get the second layer on the leaves. I don't want to have to go in and put a third layer on and change the way that they look again. So I kind of just made my peace with it and sort of put it down to sort of a bit of artistic balance within the painting. But overall, I'd have to say I was really pleased with the way that this second coat went on. And I'm not really a second coat person. I usually do watercolors, and I do like a first layer of watercolors usually, and that's fine. And I try and get it right for me first time. So this is something that I have to get used to if I was going to use acrylics a bit more. The idea of putting on a looser, rougher first coat, and then perhaps giving it a bit more polish with a second coat. Not a deal breaker, but you know, something I'd have to get used to. The other thing you won't see me doing here is the gallery wrap, so painting the leaves second coat on the edges, and that's because leaning in my hand at an angle trying to paint on the easel gave me a little bit of tennis elbow. So I basically left those bits and I will paint those at a later date. I need to figure out how to support my arm a bit better if I'm going to be doing more gallery wraps, that's for sure. Now, for the strange shapes in the centre of the tulip, I put down a sort of base butterscotchy kind of colour first of all, which you can already see that I've done. And then I started putting on the highlighted areas. And for this I was using pretty much just a sort of white mixed in with the butterscotch, but it was too pale, it was too white. So once that had dried, I then mixed up a bit of yellow and I basically glazed the yellow because it's so transparent. I just glazed it over the top of the colours that were already there. Now, as I put the finishing touches to this, let me know in the comments below what you thought of my first foray into acrylics in over 20 years. Any advice, any bits of hints and tips will be gratefully appreciated. And if you want to have a crack at doing this yourself, I'll put the link to the photo. It's my own photo, so I'll put a link to the photo below. And also, I think I've shared it on the community tab of YouTube already as well. Hopefully you'll like, share and subscribe, and if you're interested in the brand of acrylics that I use, they're called NOVA Acrylic paints, and I'll pop a link to a video I've done about them on this screen and down below. Thanks for watching.